The problem when you're teaching through the Gospels is not with the stuff that you don't understand, that you can disregard. It's the stuff that is perfectly understandable, that rubs you the wrong way, that is problematic about teaching the Gospels, and we're running into one of those passages today. Before we start, I would like you to grant Jesus 4 assumptions. Okay? Number 1, can we grant that Jesus was an adult? I'm getting a yes from Tom and a yes from over there. The rest of you are equivocal. Number 2, can we grant that Jesus was of at least average intelligence? I'm getting a yes from Brittany. Number 3, can we grant that Jesus was at least fluent in Aramaic and capable of choosing his words? Okay, we're getting some good affirmation there. 4th, and this is new from when we talked about blessed are the persecuted, which was not a warm, fuzzy passage either. Can we grant that Jesus was aware of what was going on around him? Okay, I'm getting some chuckles and some nods, so we'll have to table that one. Now, I will submit that today's passage... Nick, may I have the next slide, please? No, you skipped... there we are. Yeah, you chuckle. I will submit that today's passage is every bit as pertinent, perhaps more pertinent than it was when Jesus spoke to his guys at the top of the hill, and I present as evidence this bumper sticker, which you all have probably seen more than once or twice. And I would also submit that what he has to say is perhaps even more offensive to our ears than it was to the ears of the guys at the top of the hill. But let's review the setting for the Sermon on the Mount. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. From my favorite gospel, the gospel that was written by the doc. We know what the political setting was when Jesus was delivering the Sermon on the Mount. We all know about Pontius Pilate, not a nice guy. We know about Herod, the grandson of Herod the Great, who had all those infants killed. Tiberius Caesar, you may not be quite so familiar with. Tiberius Caesar was 55 years old when he became an emperor. He was the oldest person to ascend to the Roman throne in ancient history. So the guy had been around. He was probably the most skillful general that Rome ever produced. This guy was even better at conquest than Julius Caesar. He liked war. War was his comfort zone. He did not like administration. So by the time that in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, he had retired to Capri and had left the management of the Roman Empire to his military, the guys he was used to working with. Now, he did keep tabs on things. If somebody was threatening his throne, he would denounce them to the Senate, and they would have him executed, or his opponent would find himself suddenly, mysteriously poisoned. He did not always abide by the Roman Constitution strictly interpreted. May I have the next slide, please? Okay. Jesus begins this section of the Sermon on the Mount with this familiar quotation. It may sound a little bit rough to our modern ears, but let's think about the cultural context. In the ancient Near East, as in some traditional honor cultures today, if there's an injury, justice is meted out as revenge. If you're able to do your own revenge, that's fine. If not, any number of your relatives would exact revenge. No trial by jury, no statute of limitations, no limits on the vengeance that's extracted. Now, may I have the next slide, please? We will get through this, Nick. It's not going to be as rough as Amos. Most of us think of Genesis chapter 4. Oh, yeah, that's the chapter where Cain kills Abel. Well, if we read on down past the genealogies, another 5 generations, we run into this guy. Kid strikes me, I kill kid. Okay, it's a little bit of overkill, and he may not have been of age, but this is an example of the culture that God is speaking into when he delivers what we have there quoted in the top of verse 38. Next slide, Nick. Thank you. Fast forward to 1445 BC, give or take. Yahweh has delivered Israel from Egypt. He's giving them his laws, and as he's doing so, he gives them this law. Now, you can find similar quotations in Exodus, in Deuteronomy, but we're going to go with this one for now. You see 2 things. Number 1, proportionality. Somebody knocks out a tooth gets knocked out. No, somebody knocks out tooth, I kill that person. So there's a limit put on there. The other thing that you see there is that the same rules apply to everybody. No distinctions, nobody gets special treatment. Now, if we go to the parallel passage in Deuteronomy, we see a couple more things. Number 1 is that retribution is taken out of the hands of the offended. Retribution, when it is rendered, will be rendered by the judges after a thorough investigation. So, no, personal retaliation is now totally out of bounds. So, thank you. So far from being barbaric, the passage that Jesus is quoting actually contains violence. And what this does is to demonstrate the nature of Yahweh, who tells Moses when he appears to him on the top of Sinai, the Lord God, compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth. And so you can see this in what Jesus is quoting there at the top of Matthew 5:38. Next slide. So as we've been talking about for the last 6 weeks, the problem is not inadequacy of the law. If putting a lid on retribution, putting it into the hands of judges was sufficient, then we would be done. But the problem, as Jesus has been making clear, is not an inadequate law. The problem is with the human heart. The human heart, unregenerated, is capable of desiring the kind of disproportionate revenge that we saw initially with Lamech. Thank you. I saw this one about 3 weeks ago. I was driving back home one evening, and you chuckle. I hope that none of you was driving the big, jacked up, shiny white 3/4 ton that cut me off on 3rd Street. I hear more chuckling. See, Jesus, your word still is pertinent to our situation. The same desire for, I am going to get even and then some, is still in our hearts. I can tell that from the chuckling. So that brings us to verse 39. You may or may not cringe. You may chuckle at verse 38. Verse 39, the second part, we flat out do not like. I don't want to sound like some sort of wimpy pushover. Matter of fact, Jesus, I might grab that first part and say, but, I am acting out of righteous indignation. Or I'm standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. But turning the other cheek, where in the world are you coming from there, Jesus? But remember the context that Jesus is talking about here. No, personal retribution is off the board. May I have the next slide, please? We'll get through this. I am definitely supposed to resist sin, especially when that sin comes from my own pride, my own selfishness, my own covetousness. And you will recall from 8 weeks ago when we saw Isaiah standing up to King Manasseh, when we saw Amos standing up to King Jeroboam the second. There is a time to stand up against evil when it's on behalf of either the oppressed or when it's a matter of me resisting my own sin. Next slide, please. We're familiar with these guys who stood up in the face of Nebuchadnezzar and said, no, we are not going to commit idolatry because we know our God and we are going to worship him and him only, and we are willing to take the heat, pardon the intentional pun. So, next slide, please. Okay, thank you. The Bible is brutally honest. These guys stood up to Nebuchadnezzar, and at the time that Nebuchadnezzar was ruling, there was an anonymous psalmist who was exiled to Babylon who wrote this. Yes, this is in your Bibles. We don't like to talk about things, but the Bible is brutally honest. The Bible captures our hearts. And this was in the heart of the psalmist in Psalm 137. Now, what he is calling for is not disproportional revenge. If you read 2 Kings 25, if you read 2 Chronicles 23, you find that what the psalmist is wishing for here is basically, God, I am looking forward to the day when somebody does to him what he did to us. Now, meanwhile, back in the ruins of Jerusalem, Jeremiah gives us a second opinion. And I know how much people like second opinions. You remember that old hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness. This is the context here. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I have hope in him, as Alicia read earlier. The Lord is good to those who wait for him. To the person who seeks him, it is good that he waits silently for the salvation of the Lord. Remember, Jeremiah is sitting in the ruins of Jerusalem after it's been decimated by Nebuchadnezzar. So far, so good? Okay, next slide, Nick. It is good for a man that he should bear the yoke in his youth. That doesn't sound so inviting, especially to your youth group, Caleb. Let him sit alone and be silent, since he has laid it on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. Perhaps there is hope. There's hope again. Let him give his cheek to the smiter. What does that sound like? Let him be filled with reproach, for the Lord will not reject forever, for he causes grief. Then he will have compassion according to his abundant loving kindness. So we have the psalmist in Psalm 137 saying, God, when am I going to get my revenge? You have Jeremiah in Lamentations 3 saying, perhaps this is God's righteous judgment on me, righteous judgment on us. I am willing to sit under that because I know, God, that you are kind and gracious. So here we have two opinions. Which sounds more like the kingdom heart? Now I see a show of hands. Psalm 137. Okay. Lamentations 3. Okay, we've got two folks who vote for Lamentations 3. The rest of you are going to go back and read 2 Kings 25 and 2 Chronicles 36 and make up your minds this afternoon. So, Nick, thank you. So we don't like it, this idea of turning the other cheek, but Jesus said it, so we have to deal with it. However, if you think about it, there are at least two outs. First of all, we could say, I don't live in Babylon or Rome or under Chinese occupation. I haven't been exiled to Babylon or Xinjiang, and so this doesn't apply to me. That was those people back there. It doesn't apply to me. The second out that we have here is, Jesus, thank you for the offer to stick up for me, but no thanks. I prefer to even my own scores, watch out for my own reputation, stick up for my own rights. And by the way, I really didn't like that. If you love me, keep my commandments bit either. If somebody wants to push me around, boy, smash their face. Next slide, please. So in Matthew 5:38 and 39, Jesus is reaching back to the Old Testament scriptures. What about this one? Let's go back to the book of Deuteronomy on the next slide. As God is leading his people to the promised land, again, he's giving them his laws, and he is setting up in Deuteronomy chapter 24, this is how you deal with the poor who are among you, and we're going to get back to that when we get to verse 42. But at that time, there were folks who were so poor that literally the only thing they had to offer as collateral was their cloak, which served as clothing during the daytime and their bedroll at night. Now, this same merciful God who put the lid on retribution for personal injuries also says, if that's all the collateral that they have, creditor, you give that back to them every night so that they don't freeze to death. God was watching out for them. Now, this was not the case under Roman law. Under Roman law, the borrower truly was the lender's slave. The Romans were the ones who invented debtors' prisons. And if a Roman creditor was not satisfied with his debtor's repayment, he could confiscate his collateral. He could have the debtor thrown in prison. He could sell off all of his stuff. He could have the debtor sold into slavery and, take the profits to pay off the loan. If the creditor was really upset with the debtor, he could take him to the Roman courts, say, this guy is a deadbeat, and he could have him executed or drawn and quartered. This is what happens if you don't pay your debts, so pay up. Now, this may help us to make sense out of Matthew 5, 25 and 26, by the way. Next slide, please. Remember that one of the guys sitting at the top of the hill is Simon the Zealot, and stuck there in his cloak is a dagger, which he is just waiting to stick it to some Roman. So how does this sound to him? Was this Roman law on indebtedness a violation of what we saw in the book of Deuteronomy? Yes or no? Okay, I'm getting a nod from Tom. Thank you. Yeah, it was a violation of the Mosaic law. Was it oppressive? Yeah. So does Jesus renounce the law? Does he say you can disregard this one? What does he say? Answer on the next slide. By the time that Peter wrote this, Tiberius had died. The Romans had gone through 3 more emperors, and you had this smiling gentleman. Okay, pop quiz. Anybody know who that is on the left? Nero. Very good. You get a star for the day. So by the time that Peter wrote this, Nero was now the emperor. Nero, by the way, was not a nice guy. For those who are not familiar with ancient history, Peter was another one of the guys who was sitting on the top of the hill listening to Jesus say this. And this is what Peter is saying, knowing who the guy making the law is, and this is Peter's take on what Jesus is saying. Doesn't matter if I don't like the guy, doesn't matter if I didn't vote for the guy, doesn't matter if his laws are unjust. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king, which is similar to what Alicia read earlier. We really don't like that bit about submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution. That's pretty open-ended there, Peter. Next slide, please. Okay, Jesus, I really didn't like the idea of surrendering my rights to defend my own privileges, my own reputation. Now you're messing with my stuff. And by the way, Peter, I really didn't like that piece about being God's bond slave. I really want to be able to call my own shots. Next slide. Now, there is no Old Testament analog to this one, so if you've still got a thumb in Deuteronomy, you can take it out for right now. This is straight out of the Roman law. Now, those of you who have heard this passage preached before have probably heard that a Roman soldier could pull aside a passerby and say, hey, carry my stuff for a mile. It was actually worse than that. Under the Roman law, in the occupied territories, any Roman citizen could snag any resident of the occupied territories and have them do the stuff that was too hard, too sweaty, too demeaning, or this is distasteful, this is yucky, I don't want to do this. And hey, Jew boy, uncross your arms. Yeah. I want you to go clean out my toilet. Yeah, I mean, this is oppression. And this is what Jesus is talking about here. This is one example. It's okay, Caden. Took care of it earlier. But, you get the idea. Under the Roman law, the Roman citizen couldn't ask, he'd command the resident of occupied Galilee to, do whatever. And Jesus doesn't denounce the law. What does he say? Yeah, you go even further. Now, as we talked about when I was preaching on blessed are the persecuted, this stuff definitely rubs me the wrong way. I like my rights, I like my stuff, and don't you dare mess with my schedule. But as Jesus is preaching this, we need to remember that he went first. When Jesus went the second mile, he was carrying a cross on his shoulders. So, next slide. We should have seen this one coming. When Jesus was talking back in Matthew 5:3, he told us that the kingdom of the heavens would belong to the poor in spirit. We drop down to verse 10, and he's talking about those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. They're going to get the kingdom of heavens. He said that the meek, the gentle, the self-restrained would inherit the earth. And here we are in Luke 22. Different context. This is right before Jesus celebrates the Last Supper, which we're going to celebrate later today. And he tells them point blank, the kingdom of the heavens doesn't operate by the same rules as the kingdoms of this earth. If you guys, and they've just been squabbling about which of us is the greater, which of us gets the best seating arrangements in the kingdom. And he says, the way that the kingdom of the heavens operates is, if you guys want the best seats, you're going to serve. This isn't the way the Gentiles do it, but this is the way that we do it. Now remember that Jesus has placed us as a city on a hill. He doesn't say, please be the city on the hill. He says, you are the city on the hill. And so if the world around us is going to have any idea of what the kingdom of the heavens is going to look like, they're going to get that idea by looking at us. Next slide, please. We're almost done. So the kingdom of the heavens works different. Jesus says, if you're a resident of my kingdom, you relinquish your rights to your stuff, to your time, to your sweat, and so on. Let's jump back to Deuteronomy. Okay. Okay, there we are. Now we're together on this, Nick. Pick up my train of thought here. This gets us to verse 42, which you just saw quickly flashing on the screen there. Jesus says, give to him who asks of you, do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Where in the world is he pulling that? Well, Jesus has just said, I know how oppressive the Romans are, but the way that you heap burning coals on their head is not by resisting them, but by submitting to them, even when it's unjust, even when it's oppressive. When we get down to verse 42, he says, and oh, by the way, in case you haven't guessed, the Romans aren't going to take care of you. As citizens in my kingdom, you need to be aware of how the others are doing around you, and you need to be the ones meeting their needs. And again, he's going back to Deuteronomy, the book that he quotes most often in the Gospels. So if you haven't read Deuteronomy recently, go home this afternoon and read Deuteronomy. But the idea here is if your brother, in this case your fellow Israelite, is in need, and you have whatever it is he needs, then give it to him, because I want you to be showing the nations around you that I am a gracious God. And because I am a gracious God, my people are gracious as well. Next slide, please. Now, we can't say that just applied to the folks back in the Old Testament because James, who grew up around Jesus, John, who was one of the guys who was at the top of the hill and was closest to Jesus, they're writing this to the church. Matter of fact, they're writing this to the early church which was being persecuted by folks like Tiberius, Nero, and their successors. So this isn't just Old Testament stuff. The other piece is that these needs may not always be material. And this is where we need to be watching out for one another. As Tom was saying earlier, we have some families in the church right now that are hurting because of the loss of fathers. And as Alicia was reading earlier, I see you, Alicia. As Alicia was reading earlier, we need to be able to rejoice with those who rejoice, to weep with those who mourn. I don't need to tell you that the Delta variant is ripping through this community right now, and if you read the medical literature, I know that all the rest of you stay up until 10 or 11 at night reading the medical literature. 1 out of 3 folks who recover from COVID are going to have ongoing symptoms. And so we praise God when we read on the prayer chain that somebody has made it out of the hospital. But are we calling them, are we dropping by to say, hey, how are you doing? Are you still feeling drug out? Do you need any help? How's it going? Are you able to go back to work? You know, how are you going to bridge that? We really need to be watching out for one another, because as Jesus is telling these guys here, if you don't watch out for one another, it ain't going to happen. And you are the city on the hill, and people are going to be watching you, and what they see is going to tell them what I'm like. Okay, next slide. We're almost done here. Thank you. So, for those of you who like to take notes, this in summary is a look at what Jesus was saying. You know, number one, if you follow me. Now remember, there's an out. Jesus, I appreciate what you said. Follow you? Are you out of your mind? But number one, relinquish any claim that we have on getting even. Number two, that yes, I am willing to endure indignity even when it's unjust in your name. Number three, I didn't vote for Tiberius, Nero, or their successors, but if God's appointed institutions, because I really believe that he is actually sovereign, make demands on me, shoot, you're wanting me to mask? Maybe I'll double mask. And number four, recognizing that everything that we have comes from God, and that kingdom citizens submit their interests and their resources to care for one another. Final slide, please. We as elders have been spending a long time the last few months. Have you been keeping track, Tom? How many months have we been camping in this passage? Okay, we're going to talk later. Is it possible to become too much conformed to the likeness of Jesus Christ? But we have been camping on this one a lot as we have been endeavoring to lead the people of God. And the first paragraph there kind of rubs you the wrong way if it means that my agenda, my schedule, my convenience is going to need to be submitted to the well-being of others. That second part is hard, because if I have the attitude which is in Christ Jesus, I recognize that that was the attitude that led him to the cross. Now, today, we have the privilege of celebrating the Lord's Supper. And one of the many things that we have the privilege of doing every time we celebrate the Lord's Supper is to preach a sermon. See, you all get to preach here in a minute as well. And Paul said that every time that we celebrate the supper, we are proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. Now, if you think about that, there's more wrapped up in there, because his death until he comes means his death, his burial, his resurrection, his ascension, and his return. So we are preaching a 5-part sermon to the world. And then as the city on the hill, we go out of here and we live to reflect the nature of the God who has redeemed us.